Detroit streets, loyalty and betrayal. The year was 1993, and Detroit was a city caught between worlds. The Renaissance Center gleamed like a promise downtown while the neighborhoods told a different story. Abandoned lots scattered through the east side like missing teeth in a broken smile. The auto plants were cut in shifts, and for young cats coming up, the streets offered opportunities that legitimate work couldn't match. 5 friends from Cooley High had stayed tight through everything: graduation, hustling, heartbreak, and betrayal. They'd all grown up on Hubbell Avenue, just blocks from the school that opened its doors back in 1928, long before their grandparents were even born. The red brick building at 15,055 Hubbell had watched over generations of Northwest Detroit kids, and these 5 had walked those same hallways their parents had walked, sat in the same classrooms where dreams were born and died every semester. They'd all turned 25 that summer, old enough to know better, but still young enough to think they were invincible. Big Tim rolled through 7 Mile in his powder blue 1989 Cadillac Eldorado, the kind with the wire wheels that caught sunlight like diamonds. Tim was a walk-in jewelry store, his neck heavy with 3 gold chains of different lengths, the longest one holding a diamond-encrusted medallion the size of a silver dollar. His wrist carried matching Rolex presidential watches on both arms, and his fingers sparkled with rings on every digit except his thumbs. Tim's wardrobe was his armor: silk Versace shirts in bold prints that cost more than most people's rent, custom-tailored linen suits from a shop downtown that knew his measurements by heart. His shoe game was legendary throughout the east side: Italian leather Maury Gators in every color, Stacey Adams wingtips polished to mirror shine, and a collection of Air Jordans that he kept in their original boxes like sacred relics. Even his socks were silk, imported from Italy and changed twice daily whether they needed it or not. Tim's problem was his mouth and his need to be seen. Every Friday night, he'd hit the circuit, starting at the Diamond Lounge on Jefferson where the older players held court, then rolling through Chuck's Millionaire Club on 8 Mile, where the young money gathered. Saturday nights were for Verdell's on the east side, where the music was always on point and the women dressed to kill. When he really wanted to stunt, Tim would end up at Club Celebrity downtown, where out-of-town ballers came to see and be seen. The bartenders at all these spots knew his drink, Hennessy, neat with a beer back, and the dancers knew his money was good. But flashing paper in Detroit clubs was like painting a target on your back, especially when younger cats were watching from the corners, calculating how much easier it would be to take than to earn. Chuck lived in a different world entirely. While Tim was all about the flash, Chuck moved in shadows like a predator studying prey. He'd learned early that loud cats get caged, so he kept his business quiet and his method surgical. Chuck would spend weeks stalking his targets, dope boys who thought they were untouchable. He'd sit in stolen cars for hours, watching from 3 blocks away through binoculars, learning their patterns. He knew which corner they worked, what time they started, when they went to eat, who they called when they needed to re-up. Chuck would follow them home to their baby mama's houses, learn their children's names, find out where their mothers lived. He studied them like a college student preparing for finals, taking notes in a composition book he kept under his mattress. When Chuck finally made his move, it was with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of an executioner. His anger ran deep, rooted in watching his pops get laid off from the Chrysler plant when he was 12, watching his mother work double shifts at the hospital just to keep the lights on. Every dealer he robbed was payback for every broken promise the system had made to his family. Chuck had a daughter with China, little Keisha, 3 years old with her mama's pretty eyes and his stubborn streak. The relationship with China was toxic as paint fumes, all screaming matches and passionate reconciliations that left them both exhausted. China's mother, Miss Gloria, stayed on China about getting more money out of Chuck. That man need to pay for his child, she'd lecture from her spot on the plastic-covered couch in their house on Conan Street. You too pretty to be struggling, baby girl. China was indeed beautiful, light-skinned with red undertones, curves that stopped traffic, and a smile that could convince a preacher to sin. But China was more than just a pretty face. She was a woman trapped between worlds, trying to navigate motherhood, poverty, and the limited options available to young black women in Detroit. She'd gotten pregnant with Keisha at 19 before she really understood what that meant for her future. Chuck wasn't the man she'd dreamed of. He was angry, dangerous, and emotionally unavailable. But he was loyal, and he loved his daughter fiercely. China stayed with him partly out of love, partly out of fear, and partly because she didn't know what other choices she had. Beauty in Detroit came with a price tag, and China was learning it the hard way. She danced at the Pink Pony, the strip club on 7 Mile right next to Larry's Coney Island, where the lamb chili was legendary, and the conversation was always about who was getting money and who was getting got. The relationship with Chuck was toxic as paint fumes, passionate reconciliations followed by screaming matches that left them both exhausted, and Keisha hiding in her bedroom with her hands over her ears. China's mother, Miss Gloria, stayed on China about getting more money out of Chuck, never understanding that Chuck gave what he could when he could, but the street life didn't come with steady paychecks or health insurance. China's stage name was Desire, and she knew how to work it. When that Isley Brothers track Between the Sheets came on, she could make a room full of hustlers forget they had business to handle. The money was good, better than anything she could make with her high school diploma, but the life was wearing on her. Every night she came home smelling like cigarettes and cheap cologne, counting wrinkled bills while Keisha slept in the next room. China told herself she was doing it for her daughter, giving Keisha the things she never had. But the truth was more complicated. Part of her enjoyed the power that came with her beauty, the way men would spend their rent money just to see her smile. Part of her was addicted to the attention, to being desired and wanted, even if it was only for her body. And part of her was trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. A baby daddy who was in and out of jail, a mother who expected her to be the family's financial salvation, and a society that offered limited options to young black women with more beauty than education. China wasn't perfect. She made selfish choices, told lies to protect herself, and sometimes used her sexuality as a weapon. But she was trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to destroy women like her. Diamond had taken a different path, or at least she tried to. She'd been the smart one in their crew, the one who actually paid attention in Mrs. Patterson's English class and talked about going to Wayne State. Diamond had worked at the Ford credit office downtown for 3 years after high school, taking the bus from her apartment on Finkel to the Renaissance Center every morning in her pressed skirts and sensible shoes. But the streets have a way of calling you back. It started with smoking weed with her cousin Trina on weekends, just to unwind from the stress of dealing with white supervisors who pronounced her name wrong and acted like she should be grateful for the opportunity. Then Trina started bringing around this dude Marcus, who always had that good green laced with something extra, just a little, something to take the edge off, he said. Diamond learned to read men the way some people read newspapers, quickly, and for the information that mattered. When she spotted a potential mark, her entire persona would shift like a chameleon changing colors. Her voice would get softer, more breathless, and she'd let her hand linger on their arm just a second longer than necessary. Diamond would dress the part too. Tight designer jeans that hugged every curve, low-cut tops that revealed just enough cleavage to distract from the hunger in her eyes, and heels high enough to make her legs look like they went on forever. She'd wear subtle makeup that took an hour to perfect, creating the illusion of natural beauty while hiding the toll the drugs were taking on her skin. Her hair was always immaculate, relaxed bone straight and flowing down her back like silk curtains. When she walked into a room, Diamond moved with the calculated grace of a predator, her hips swaying just enough to catch attention without looking desperate. She'd position herself at the bar where the light hit her just right, order something expensive that she'd barely touch, and wait for the right mark to approach. Diamond could spot money from across a crowded room. It was in the way a man carried himself, the quality of his shoes, whether his jewelry was real gold or that fake stuff that turned your skin green. Now Diamond was dancing at the Pink Pony too, but not by choice. The crack had taken her job, her apartment, and her pride. She moved through the club like a ghost, picking up money from the floor, turning tricks in the parking lot with regular customers who remembered when she used to be something different. Her daughter Anya stayed with Diamond's mother in River Rouge, safe from the chaos, but growing up without her mama. Marcus lived in Oak Park, in a one-bedroom apartment near Northland Mall, where he ran credit card scams and welfare frauds with the efficiency of a small business. Marcus was smooth, the kind of cat who could convince a woman to hand over her government check and thank him for the privilege. He kept his hair in neat braids, wore cologne that cost more than some people's rent, and always had the right words to make a woman feel special. But Marcus was poison wrapped in pretty packaging, a narcissist who saw every person in his life as a tool to be used and discarded when they were no longer useful. Marcus's apartment was his office. Mail from different names scattered across the kitchen table, credit card machines lined up like soldiers, fake IDs scattered like playing cards. He'd learned the game from his older cousin Damon, who'd been running schemes since the 80s, but Marcus had perfected the art of emotional manipulation in ways that made Damon look like an amateur. "It's about presentation, young blood," Damon had taught him. "Look successful, sound successful, and people will give you their success." But Marcus took it further. He studied psychology books stolen from the public library, learning how to identify and exploit people's deepest insecurities. The women Marcus targeted were easy to spot. Single mothers struggling to make ends meet, older ladies on fixed incomes, women like Diamond who needed to believe somebody cared about them. He'd meet them at the grocery store on 8 Mile, strike up conversations about how expensive everything was getting, then slowly work his way into their lives and their bank accounts. Marcus was a master of the long con. He'd spend months building trust, playing the perfect boyfriend, meeting their children, attending family barbecues, becoming indispensable before revealing his true nature. He had no loyalty to anyone, not even the crew he'd grown up with. When Marcus slept with China, it wasn't about desire or love. It was about proving he could take something that belonged to Chuck, about asserting his dominance in the only way his cowardly nature would allow. The 5 friends still met up sometimes, usually at the Coney Island on 7 Mile after the Pink Pony closed, or sometimes at the Diamond Lounge when they wanted to talk business in a more upscale setting. The Diamond Lounge was where the serious players conducted their affairs, dimly lit booths in the back where conversations were private, and the bartender knew to stay away unless signaled. Chuck preferred Chuck's Millionaire Club when he needed to meet with his stick-up crew. The club's name was pure coincidence, but Chuck took it as a sign that he was meant to get money there. Marcus would hold court at Verdell's, charming older women who had steady government checks and lonely hearts. They'd sit in the red vinyl booths under fluorescent lights that made everybody look sick, eating loose burgers and chili fries while they caught up on the neighborhood gossip, or nursing expensive cognac in the plush atmosphere of whichever club suited their business that night. The conversations were carefully constructed. Nobody talked too much business, nobody asked too many questions, but everybody knew everybody else's situation. The tension between Big Tim and Chuck had been building for months. It started small, Chuck making comments about Tim's flashy lifestyle, Tim implying that Chuck wasn't handling his responsibilities as a father. But underneath was something deeper, the kind of resentment that grows when 2 men want the same territory and only one can have it. Tim controlled most of the heroin trade on the east side, moving product through a network of young boys who sold on street corners and in party stores. But Tim never forgot where he came from, those Hubbell Avenue streets where he learned his first lessons about respect and money. Sometimes he'd cruise past Cooley High in his Eldorado, windows down, music bumping, remembering when his biggest worry was passing Mrs. Johnson's algebra class and getting China to notice him at lunch. Chuck's stick-up crew had been hitting Tim's people, never directly challenging him, but making it clear that his operation wasn't untouchable. Every time one of Tim's spots got robbed, Chuck's name came up in conversations, whispered like a curse by dealers who remembered when they were all just kids walking home from school together down Hubbell. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in September. Tim was making his usual rounds. He'd started the evening at Chuck's Millionaire Club, throwing hundreds around like confetti. then moved to Club Celebrity downtown, where he bought bottles for tables full of women he didn't know. By the time he reached the Pink Pony at midnight, Tim was already drunk on Hennessy and his own reputation. China was working her usual Tuesday crowd, but something was different that night. She kept looking toward the back of the club where Chuck sat in a corner booth, nursing a beer and watching everything with those cold eyes that made people nervous. Marcus had been buying China drinks all night, whispering in her ear about how beautiful she was, how she deserved better than what she was getting. The cocaine he'd been feeding her made everything feel electric, made his words sound like poetry. When China's shift ended at 2 in the morning, Marcus convinced her to come back to his place in Oak Park. What happened next would change everything. China, high and vulnerable, found herself in Marcus's bed while Keisha slept at Miss Gloria's house. The betrayal was complete. She was cheating on Chuck with one of their own crew, motivated partly by drugs, partly by Marcus's smooth talk, and partly by her anger at Chuck's refusal to leave the streets and be a real father to their daughter. 3 weeks later, China realized she was pregnant. The timing was suspicious. She'd been with both Chuck and Marcus during the same period, and there was no way to know for certain who the father was. China made a decision that would haunt all of them. She would let Chuck believe the baby was his. But secrets in Detroit don't stay buried long. Big Tim had been watching Marcus's operation, considering whether to muscle in on the credit card game. During his surveillance, he'd seen China leaving Marcus's apartment early one morning, and being the observant hustler he was, Tim put 2 and 2 together. Tim saw an opportunity. He approached China at Verdell's one night when she was off work, sitting at the bar nursing a drink and watching the older couple slow dance to Marvin Gaye. The lighting was low, the atmosphere intimate, perfect for the kind of conversation that could change everything. "I know about you and Marcus," he said simply, sliding into the chair next to her. "Chuck might want to know too, unless we can work something out." The blackmail was sophisticated. Tim didn't want money. He had plenty of that. What he wanted was information about Chuck's operations, details about his stick-up jobs, anything that would give Tim an advantage in their growing war. China found herself trapped between 2 men who saw her as a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. For months, China fed Tim information about Chuck's movements, his plans, his weaknesses. Every detail she shared felt like another piece of her soul being sold. But the alternative, losing her daughter, losing Chuck, having her business scattered through the neighborhood like yesterday's newspaper, seemed worse. Meanwhile, Diamond's crack habit was spiraling out of control. The beautiful girl who'd once dreamed of college was now turning tricks in cars behind the Pink Pony, doing whatever it took to get her next hit. The other dancers watched her decline with a mixture of pity and fear. Pity because they remembered who she used to be. Fear because they saw their own possible futures in her story. One night in December, Diamond got arrested in an undercover sting operation behind the club. The detective who cuffed her was a young black woman who looked like Diamond might have looked in another life. College-educated, professional, confident. "You don't have to live like this," the detective said as she processed Diamond's arrest. "Help us clean up this neighborhood, and we can help you clean up your life." The offer was simple. Information about the Pink Pony's operations, details about who was selling drugs in the club, who was running guns, who was organizing the prostitution. In exchange, Diamond would get treatment instead of prison time, a chance to get her daughter back, a shot at redemption. What the detective didn't tell Diamond was that Chuck had been their real target all along. Chuck's stick-up crew had been hidden more than just drug dealers. They'd been robbing armored car crews, bank couriers, anybody carrying serious money. The FBI had been building a RICO case against Chuck for months, but they needed someone close to him to make it stick. Diamond's arrest was the leverage they needed. Facing 5 years in prison and the permanent loss of her daughter, Diamond agreed to wear a wire. The irony was bitter. The girl who'd once been the moral center of their group was now being asked to betray the man who'd been like a brother to her. The wire Diamond wore was state-of-the-art. invisible to casual inspection but powerful enough to pick up conversations across a crowded room. For 3 months, she recorded Chuck's conversations at the Coney Island, at family barbecues, in the back booths of the Diamond Lounge where Chuck thought he was safe, even during casual encounters at Chuck's Millionaire Club when he'd stop by to check on his territory. Every laugh they shared, every story about the old days, every moment of genuine friendship was being transmitted to federal agents sitting in surveillance vans. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a cold February night. China, 6 months pregnant and tired of living with Tim's blackmail, decided to tell Chuck the truth about the baby's father. She chose the worst possible moment, right after Chuck had just told her about a major job his crew was planning, a robbery that would set them up for life. Chuck's reaction was explosive. The rage that had been building in him since childhood, at his father's unemployment, at his mother's exhaustion, at a system that seemed designed to crush men like him, finally found a target. He didn't just want to hurt Marcus, he wanted to destroy him completely. But Chuck was thinking with his heart instead of his head, and in the streets, that kind of mistake gets you killed or caged. The job he'd mentioned to China, robbing a drug dealer's stash house in Grosse Pointe Park, was exactly the kind of interstate commerce violation the FBI needed to make their RICO case stick. The night of the robbery, everything went wrong. The house was supposed to be occupied by just 2 people, but 8 armed men were waiting when Chuck's crew arrived. The setup was perfect. Too perfect. Chuck realized in the moment before the shooting started that somebody had betrayed him, but he couldn't figure out who. Chuck made it out of the house, but 2 of his crew didn't. The newspapers the next day talked about a shootout between rival drug dealers, but Chuck knew better. This wasn't a rival crew. This was law enforcement, and somebody he trusted had put him in their crosshairs. The paranoia that followed was consuming. Chuck suspected everybody. China because of the pregnancy situation, Marcus because of the obvious motive, even Tim because of their ongoing territorial disputes. What he never suspected was Diamond, the girl who'd been recording his conversations for months while struggling with her own demons. The FBI moved fast after the failed robbery. Within a week, they had enough evidence to arrest Chuck, Marcus, and 3 other members of their crew. The charges were serious: conspiracy, racketeering, interstate transportation of stolen goods. Chuck was looking at 25 years to life. But the biggest shock came during the arraignment. Chuck's lawyer handed him a copy of the government's evidence, and there, on page 12, was a transcript of a conversation between Chuck and Diamond, recorded just 3 days before the robbery. Every word was perfectly clear, every detail of the planned crime laid out like a roadmap to conviction. Chuck's eyes found Diamond in the courtroom gallery, sitting next to her mother and holding 3-year-old Ania. Diamond couldn't meet his gaze. The girl who'd once been the conscience of their group, who'd lectured them about staying in school and making something of themselves, had become the instrument of his destruction. The trial lasted 3 months. Chuck's lawyer argued entrapment, claiming that Diamond had been coerced into betraying her friend. The prosecutor painted Chuck as a career criminal who'd preyed on his community for years. The jury deliberated for 2 days before finding Chuck guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, Chuck finally spoke. He looked directly at Diamond and said, "I understand why you did it. I even forgive you for it. But I want everybody in this courtroom to know the truth. The system didn't catch me. The system turned my own people against me." Diamond broke down crying. Through her tears, she managed to say, "I'm sorry, Chuck. I'm so sorry." The judge sentenced Chuck to 20 years in federal prison. As the bailiffs led him away in shackles, he turned back one last time to look at his friends. Tim was there, stone-faced and calculating, probably already figuring out how to take over Chuck's abandoned territory. Marcus was there, sweating despite the air conditioning, knowing that his own legal troubles were just beginning. China was there, 7 months pregnant and alone, realizing that she'd lost the only man who'd ever really loved her for who she was instead of what she could do for him. And Diamond was there, clean for the first time in 2 years, thanks to the treatment program she'd entered as part of her cooperation agreement, holding her daughter and wondering if saving herself had been worth destroying her friend. After Chuck's conviction, the group scattered like autumn leaves. Tim expanded his operation into Chuck's old territory, but the victory felt hollow. Without Chuck as an adversary, the game lost some of its excitement. Tim still made his rounds: the Diamond Lounge, Chuck's Millionaire Club, Verdell's Club Celebrity. But now, he moved with bodyguards and constantly looked over his shoulder. Within 6 months, Tim's flashy lifestyle caught up with him when a rival crew from the west side decided he was disrespecting their territory and shot him outside Club Celebrity as he was leaving with 2 women he'd been buying drinks for all night. He survived, but lost the use of his left arm and most of his drug network. Marcus pled guilty to credit card fraud and got 3 years in federal prison. His smooth talk and expensive cologne didn't impress the federal judge who sentenced him. The women he'd scammed testified against him, describing how he'd convinced them to hand over their benefits while pretending to care about their children's futures. China had her baby, a little boy she named Charles after Chuck, regardless of who the biological father was. She quit dancing and moved back in with her mother, using the money she'd saved from the Pink Pony to start a small catering business. The baby looked like Chuck, which was either a blessing or a curse depending on how you looked at it. Diamond got her daughter back and found work as a substance abuse counselor at a clinic in Highland Park. The irony wasn't lost on her, helping other people overcome the same demons that had nearly destroyed her life. She never talked about her role in Chuck's conviction, but everybody in the neighborhood knew. Some people called her a hero for helping clean up the streets. Others called her a snitch and crossed the street when they saw her coming. Chuck served 12 years of his 20-year sentence before being released on parole. He came home to a Detroit that had changed dramatically. Downtown was being redeveloped. Young white professionals were moving into neighborhoods that had been abandoned for decades, and the drug game had evolved beyond recognition. Chuck found work at a community center in Hamtramck, teaching kids about the consequences of street life. He never married, never had other children, and rarely talked about the old days. Sometimes, people would recognize him and whisper about what had happened, about the betrayal in the trial and the time when the neighborhood was different. On quiet Sunday afternoons, Chuck would sometimes drive past the old places, Cooley High's red brick facade at 15,055 Hubbell, the same building that had been educating Northwest Detroit kids since 1928, the Coney Island on 7 Mile, the empty lot where the Pink Pony used to be before it was torn down for a dollar store. He'd cruise down Hubbell Avenue slowly, remembering when it was just a street where kids played and not a battleground where friends became enemies. He'd cruise past the Diamond Lounge, now a church, and the building that used to house Chuck's Millionaire Club, now a beauty supply store. Verdell's had been converted into a community center, and Club Celebrity had closed down when downtown started changing. He'd think about his friends and the choices they'd all made, about loyalty and betrayal, and the price of survival in a city that chewed up dreams and spit out regrets. The final twist in their story came 5 years after Chuck's release. Diamond, now a supervisor at the substance abuse clinic, was going through old case files when she discovered something that changed everything. Chuck hadn't been the FBI's primary target after all. Tim had been. The federal agents had been building a case against Tim's drug operation, and Chuck's crew had just gotten caught in the crossfire. The detective who'd recruited Diamond had lied about almost everything. Chuck's stick-up crew wasn't a RICO target. They were small-time compared to the major drug organizations the FBI was tracking. Diamond had betrayed her friend not to take down a dangerous criminal organization, but to help federal agents make their arrest quotas look better. Diamond tried to contact Chuck to tell him what she'd learned, but he'd moved away from Detroit years earlier. Some people said he'd gone to Atlanta, others said California. Nobody knew for sure, and maybe that was for the best. Some truths are too heavy to carry, and some betrayals cut too deep to heal. In the end, they were all casualties of the same war, a war between poverty and opportunity, between loyalty and survival, between the streets and the system. They'd started as friends with dreams and ended as strangers with regrets, scattered across a country that had never quite figured out what to do with young black lives that didn't fit into neat categories. The neighborhood remembered them in fragments, stories told in barbershops and beauty salons, legends whispered by younger cats who thought they could do it better, warnings shared by mothers who'd watched too many promising children disappear into the game. Their story became part of Detroit's mythology, another chapter in the endless book of what happens when the American dream meets the American reality. Old heads still talked about the nights when Tien would roll through all 4 clubs in one evening, or how Chuck got his nickname from the club that bore his name, or the way Diamond used to light up Virgil's dance floor before the drugs took her light away. The kids who walked down Hubbell Avenue to Cooley High now heard whispered stories about the 5 friends who'd once had the world in their hands, back when the neighborhood still believed in happy endings. Detroit kept changing, kept evolving, kept promising that tomorrow would be different from yesterday. But in the places where they used to meet, the Coney Island, the street corners, the hallways of Cooley High, where new generations of Hubbell Avenue kids still walked and dreamed and planned their futures, their ghosts lingered like smoke from a cigarette that never quite burns out. The city moved on, but their story remained, a reminder of friendship and betrayal, of loyalty and survival, of the choices that define us and the consequences that follow us long after we think we've left them behind.